My name is Sophia. I am a citizen of Ephesus, where there is a large Christian community here at the beginning of the 2nd century, after the birth of Christ. This church was founded by a missionary named Paul about 50 years ago, and I have been drawn to it by the kind of people who are in it, how they care for one another and the world. So I have come seeking to know more about this Jesus whom they follow and the God that he made known through his life and death. However, before I can be baptized and received into the faith, I must first receive instruction, because being Greek, I know very little about the history and the beliefs and the practices of this religion. I am fortunate in my instructors. They are 2 elderly men who knew these first disciples of Jesus personally. One of them is John Mark. He grew up in Jerusalem, and his mother was a believer in Jesus. After Jesus' death and resurrection appearances, the disciples, along with Jesus' mother and brothers, met in her home. So John Mark got to know these disciples well, especially Peter. When he became a teenager, he went with his uncle, Barnabas, and the Apostle Paul on their first missionary trip to Cyprus. Later, he went to Rome, where Paul was imprisoned, to help him. But most importantly, about 30 years ago, he wrote a biography about Jesus. He got his information from Peter, so it's firsthand from someone who was actually there with Jesus and knew all the things that happened. My other instructor is a man named John the Elder. He got his information from the disciple John. John was the youngest disciple, and Jesus loved him dearly. He lived to be very old here in Ephesus, and the church encouraged him to record his remembrances. John the Elder wrote them down, so we have another book about Jesus by these 2 men. It is very different from Mark's, I suppose because Peter and John were very different. Peter was blunt and matter of fact. He just stated the facts, got straight to the point. John, he was more reflective. He wanted to know the meaning behind Jesus' actions and words. And since he lived so long, he had a lifetime to reflect on his experiences with Jesus and their meaning. So he didn't tell the story to John the Elder like a biography in chronological order from birth to death, but more like an old man's remembrances of important events and what Jesus was revealing about himself and God through them. Both of these men have made Jesus and his disciples very real to me. And because they have written this down, future generations will benefit from this also. I invite you to come with me now and listen to these 2 men tell the story as they heard it from Peter and John. They are going to tell about the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples. They will make it real for you too.
On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the day the lambs for the Passover meal were killed, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and get the Passover meal ready for you?" Then Jesus sent 2 of these with instructions. "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher says, where is the room where my disciples and I will eat the Passover meal?' Then he will show you a large upstairs room, fixed up and furnished, where you will get everything ready for us." The disciples left, went to the city, and found everything just as Jesus had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal.
Who were the two disciples he sent?
Peter and John.
Tell me about them.
Peter was a natural leader, a real extrovert. He was usually the first to speak up, blurting out what he thought and then wishing he hadn't. He often had to eat his words. His real name was Simon, but Jesus called him Peter, which means rock, because he was strong. Jesus saw these rock-like traits that were really underneath all his bravado. He was emotional, quick-tempered, impulsive, and likable. He was a very warm man.
Yeah, and he really was a man of action. Again, sometimes, though, without thinking first.
And John?
Well, John's different. I only knew him in his later years. But Mark tells me that when he was young, he and his brother James were very hot-tempered. In fact, Jesus called them sons of thunder. He and James were first cousins to Jesus. Their mother, Salome, was a sister of Mary, Jesus' mother. And this may be why they and Peter were so close to Jesus.
Yeah, that's very likely. And Jesus especially loved John. He was the youngest. And I think Jesus wanted to encourage him and help him harness his hot temper, which he did.
You know, he did. He helped him a lot. When I knew him in his old age, that hot temper was gone and he was just all love.
Anyway, he and Peter prepared the meal, and when evening came, Jesus and the others arrived. That's Jesus there, and that's James with him.
Was James anything like his brother?
Not really, except he had a temper too. There was that incident about the Samaritan village that rejected them, and they both wanted to destroy it. But James was older than John and was usually with him, perhaps to look out for him. He was very loyal to Jesus and didn't seem to have any jealousy about John's being the favorite. He was the first disciple to be martyred for his faith with that terrible beheading by Herod.
How terrible.
Sophia, it's not easy to be a Christian. That's why you must be very sure that you want to be a part of us.
Why is Jesus washing their feet?
You see, the roads in Palestine were very dusty, so a gracious host always provided a servant to wash his guests' feet when they entered his house after traveling.
But you will notice, Sophia, that Jesus, not the servant, is doing the servant's job. John told me this. It was just a very vivid memory to him. When he came to Peter, Peter blurted out, "Never, not at any time will you wash my feet."
Why?
Well, Sophia, I told you that Peter always talked first and fought later.
Peter loved Jesus. He just loved him so much. And I think he was embarrassed that Jesus had taken the servant role. But Jesus said to him, "If I do not wash your feet, you will no longer be my disciple."
And wonderful, impulsive Peter said, "Lord, do not wash only my feet then. Wash my head and my hands too." He certainly didn't want to be crossed off the disciple list. Here comes Andrew now.
Who was he?
Well, he was Peter's brother.
Was he as impulsive as Peter?
No, he was very quiet and unassuming. Just like James, he didn't seem to mind taking second place to his brother. Never begrudged the fact that he was not one of the inner circle.
You know, we could use a few more like him in the church. He was always bringing people to Jesus. In fact, he's the one that introduced Peter to Jesus.
Sophia, all four of these men were fishermen from Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee. They left a thriving business to follow Jesus. And here comes someone else from Bethsaida, Philip. As usual, he has his friend Nathanael with him.
Well, it seems to me that Philip was somewhat of a pessimist. Remember at the feeding of the 5,000, and Jesus asked him, "Where can we buy enough food to feed all these people?" And his answer was, "Well, for everyone to have enough, to even have a little, it would take more than 200 silver coins to buy enough bread." He was like a lot of people in the church who say, it would be nice to do it, but it can't be done.
Well, he was a practical man. He had a hard time believing in the power of the unseen.
Well, that's true. But here at the Last Supper, he asked Jesus to show him the Father. And he didn't understand it. They had been seeing God all along in Jesus.
But before we're too hard on him, remember that he wanted to share Christ with others. As soon as he was called, he looked up his friend Nathanael Bartholomew and invited him to meet Jesus.
Now, Nathanael was reluctant at first. He was from Cana, which was a rival village of Nazareth. So he made offhand remarks and jokes about Nazareth. In fact, he said, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Well, Philip didn't argue with him. He just said, "Come and see." And Nathanael did.
What kind of person was he?
Well, he was a sincerely devout man. Even before Philip had invited him, Jesus had observed him sitting under a fig tree in front of his house and recognized that he was very sincere about his faith.
How could Jesus tell that just by seeing him under a fig tree when he hadn't even met him?
Because, Sophia, the houses of poorer people had only one room, but almost everyone had a tall and widespread fig tree in front of their house, and they used it as a place of privacy and prayer. He was probably praying or studying the scriptures, and Jesus observed him without him knowing it.
I think you're probably right, Mark. We know that both Philip and Nathanael had been seriously studying the scriptures and trying to discover the Messiah, what the Messiah might be and who he might be. Because Philip told Nathanael, "We have found the one whom Moses wrote about in the book of the law and whom the prophets also wrote about." See, Nathanael really believed that Jesus was the Messiah.
Here comes Thomas. If Nathanael was an instant believer, Thomas was just the opposite. He had to have proof.
Yeah, he was a questioner. Again, here at this last meal when Jesus said, "You know the way that leads to the place where I'm going." And Thomas' response was, "Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know how to get there?" Well, like Philip, he was very down to earth, and he was honest about his doubts.
And he had to have proof that Jesus had been raised from the dead.
Oh, that's right. He wasn't with the others when Jesus appeared to them, and he thought that they were imagining it. Said he just wouldn't believe it unless he could put his fingers on the nail scars in Jesus' hands and put his hand on the wound in his side.
But when Jesus appeared to him and let him do this, he believed wholeheartedly. You see, I like Thomas. He was a thinker. And through his questions and honest doubts, he came to a strong faith that was his own, rather than a weak, uncommitted one based on others' beliefs.
Who are these two men?
They are two more brothers, Matthew, or sometimes they call him Levi, and James. Both of them are the sons of Alphaeus.
They don't look anything like brothers. Matthew looks like a wealthy businessman. And James looks, well, I'm not sure I'd want to be in the same room with him.
You've hit it right, Sophia. Matthew was a tax collector and very wealthy.
And also very hated by his fellow Jews. And he was also very lonely because of that. In fact, the only friends he had were other tax collectors.
Well, then how did he come to know Jesus?
He conducted his business at the seat of customs at Capernaum by the seashore where Jesus preached. Jesus had a whole lot to say about the dangers of laying up earthly treasures for yourself, and that message must have touched Matthew's heart. When Jesus called him, he gave up his position and followed him.
But he also invited other tax collectors to his home to meet Jesus, which of course got Jesus in a lot of trouble with the Pharisees.
What about his brother James? He looks dangerous.
Well, he was a zealot, like these other two men that have just come in. Zealots were extremely patriotic Jews, and they wanted to overthrow the Romans by violence. James must have hated Matthew for collaborating with the enemy. But here they are, reconciled to each other under the Spirit of Jesus. You know, that can happen in families.
Well, how did Jesus come to include zealots among his disciples since he was so opposed to violence?
That's probably why, because he was opposed to violence. He wanted to show them a better way to deal with enemies, God's way. He knew that violence only leads to more violence.
Well, did they get his message?
Well, it was hard for them and impossible for one of them. You see, Sophia, there were different ideas about the kind of person the Messiah would be. Some of the Jewish scriptures said he would be a military and political leader, well, like King David. But most Jews believed this, and certainly the zealots did. That's why these last four who have come in were attracted to Jesus. They thought he would be this kind of Messiah.
Who were these last three that have come in?
Well, the first one is Simon. He's always designated Simon the Zealot. He obviously was not quiet about his convictions. Next that came in with him was Judas Thaddeus. Yes, Judas Thaddeus. I like to call him by his second name so that we don't get him confused with Judas Iscariot.
You were asking, Sophia, if these zealots understood Jesus' message of nonviolence. Well, even here at the last meal with Jesus, they were still hoping he would be a military leader who would rally all the Jews to rise up and overthrow the Romans. Thaddeus here asked him why he wouldn't show his power and reveal himself to the world and not just to them.
Well, what did Jesus say?
Well, he tried to tell Thaddeus and all the disciples that his power came from God and that God's power is revealed through love, not through force. He pleaded with them to obey his teachings if they truly loved him.
How could they possibly not understand him?
We are all such slow learners, Sophia. Like Philip and Thomas and these super patriotic Jews, we find it easy to trust the power of human beings, which we can see, and hard to trust the power of God, which we often cannot see.
But they could see it in Jesus. He was right there with them, demonstrating it.
Yes, and he was to demonstrate it even further, as you'll see.
This last man standing alone, who is he?
He is all of us. His name is Judas Iscariot, meaning man of Kerioth, a place in Judah in the south of Palestine. He is the only disciple who was not from Galilee in the north. He stands alone partly because he senses he's an outsider.
Doesn't he relate to the other zealots? You did say these last four who came in were zealots.
Yes, that's his connection with the group. It's probably why he joined. He was looking for a leader to overthrow the Romans, and he thought he had found him in Jesus.
Why did Jesus include him? Surely he must have known what his expectations were.
I think Jesus saw other possibilities in him and hoped to draw those out. He may have admired Judas's concern for his fellow Jews suffering under the Roman yoke, and he hoped to show him a better way than insurrection to help his people. He gave him the responsibility of being the treasurer of the group, so he must have affirmed him as an honest person who could be trusted with other people's money.
And was he trustworthy?
Well, John didn't think he was. He called him a thief, so he obviously didn't trust him. I don't really know, but I do think there was little joy in him and criticism of those who didn't agree with him. But let's move on with the story.
After Jesus had washed their feet, he asked them, Do you understand what I've just done to you? I, your Lord and your teacher, I've just washed your feet. You then should wash one another's feet. I have set an example for you so that you will do what I have done for you.
As they moved to the table, James and John may have assumed they would sit on the right and left of Jesus. They had asked for this special privilege before, which had made the other disciples very angry. And Jesus had used that incident to teach all the disciples a much needed lesson about greatness and servanthood. On this occasion, he kept John on his right hand, but he invited Judas to sit at his left. This was the seat of honor at all Jewish banquets.
Why did he put Judas there? I would have thought he would have chosen Peter or anybody besides Judas.
Remember I said that Judas saw himself as an outsider? I think Jesus wanted so much for him to feel a part of the group. Jesus always reached out to include the outcasts. And on this particular night, Judas was very much on his heart because Jesus knew his intentions.
Yes, and while they were at supper, Jesus said, I have wanted so much to eat this Passover meal with you before I suffer.
Then he took a piece of bread. He gave a prayer of thanks. He broke it. And he gave it to his disciples. Take it, he said. This is my body, broken for you. Do this in memory of me. Then he took a cup. And he gave thanks to God. And he handed it to them. And they all drank from it. Jesus said, This is my blood, which is poured out for many, my blood which seals God's covenant. Whenever you drink it, do so in memory of me.
After Jesus had shared the bread and the cup, he was deeply troubled. And he declared openly to all the disciples, I'm telling you the truth. One of you is going to betray me.
The disciples were upset and began to ask him one after the other, surely you don't mean me, do you?
Peter motioned to John, who was sitting next to Jesus, and said, ask him who he's talking about. So the disciple moved closer to Jesus' side and he asked, who is it, Lord? And Jesus answered, I will dip some bread in the sauce and give it to him. He is the man. So he took a piece of bread and he dipped it and he gave it to Judas on his left and said to him privately, hurry and do what you must. None of the others at the table understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas was in charge of the money bag, some of the disciples thought that Jesus had told him to go and buy what they needed for the festival, or maybe to give something to the poor. Judas accepted the bread and went out at once into the night.
What was he planning to do?
Sophia, he had already made arrangements with the chief priests to hand Jesus over to them at night when no one was around to protest, and they promised him money. Judas knew Jesus would be going to the Garden of Gethsemane nearby to pray, and so that would take place after the meal, and that would be a good place to take him.
But why? Jesus was his friend. Why would he betray him?
Well, I don't think he saw it as betrayal. He was so obsessed with his desire to get rid of the Romans that he wanted to force Jesus to use his power. I think he believed that this confrontation would cause Jesus to become his kind of Messiah, that even the angels of God would descend to help him, and all Jerusalem would then rise up and support him and overthrow the Romans. He was wrong, of course. And when he saw his dream turn to ashes and realized how he had been used and what he had done to his friend, he couldn't live with himself. He took the money back to the priests and he went out and hanged himself.
What a tragic man. But I don't understand, Mark, why you said earlier that Judas is all of us. In what way?
Because he refused to accept Jesus for who he was, and he tried to make him into what he wanted him to be. Jesus knew that God's way was not the way of force, and so do we. But most of the time, we're afraid to trust the power of love and instead rely on might.
And often when we do that, we justify it in the name of Christ. We forget what John told me that Jesus said here at this last meal. My commandment is this: love one another just as I love you. The greatest love a person can have for his friends is to give his life for them. And you are my friends if you do what I command you. Love one another. And now, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. Come now, and let us go from this place.